Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Marcus Reed. I'm 34, and the first mistake I made at the Olympic National Forest in Washington was thinking I could capture something real with my microphone. I'd driven my RV, a modest 24-footer I'd bought after my divorce, deep into the Saul Duke Valley, following logging roads that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The podcast was supposed to be my fresh start, American Legends, where I'd travel the country recording local folklore straight from the source. What better way to launch than with the Skokomish tribe's stories about the forest spirits that supposedly roamed these ancient woods? The afternoon I arrived, September air hung thick with the smell of cedar and rotting leaves. My RV wheezed and groaned as I navigated the narrow dirt road, Douglas firs towering overhead like cathedral spires. When I finally found a clearing wide enough to park, the silence hit me like a physical weight. No birds, no insects, just the whisper of wind through the canopy and the distant murmur of the Saul Duke River. I'd arranged to meet Joseph Clearwater, an elder from the Skokomish tribe, the next morning. He'd been reluctant when I called, warning me about camping alone in this particular section of forest. "Some stories aren't meant for recording," he'd said, his voice carrying decades of authority I chose to ignore. I was a journalist after all. Well, had been before the layoffs. Now I was a podcaster chasing internet fame with a Zoom recorder and delusions of breaking through the oversaturated true crime market. The RV's generator hummed to life as I settled in for the night, the sound absurdly loud in the oppressive quiet. I'd parked at the edge of what locals called Whispering Pines, a grove of ancient trees that supposedly held special significance to the indigenous people. Through my window, I could see them swaying in the evening breeze, their movement hypnotic and somehow synchronized, as if they were dancing to music only they could hear. I spent the evening reviewing my research. The Skokomish had stories about entities they called skin stealers, creatures that could take human form and lure the unwary deep into the forest where they'd never be found. According to the tales, these beings were drawn to people who carried unresolved guilt or trauma, feeding on emotional wounds like spiritual parasites. The comparison to my own recent struggles wasn't lost on me. The divorce, the job loss, the way I'd been running from my problems instead of facing them. Maybe that's why I'd really come to the middle of nowhere with recording equipment. Around 10 p.m., I heard the first whisper. It came from outside, barely audible over the generator's hum, a voice speaking words I couldn't quite make out. When I stepped outside to investigate, flashlight in hand, the sound stopped. The beam of light penetrated maybe 20 feet into the trees before being swallowed by darkness so complete it seemed to have substance. I called out a tentative, "Hello," but received only my echo in response. Back inside, I chalked it up to wind through the branches and tried to sleep. The whispers came again at 3 a.m. This time they were closer, circling the RV in a slow, deliberate pattern. Multiple voices now, speaking in what sounded like an indigenous language I didn't recognize. The hair on my arm stood up as I pressed my ear to the thin aluminum wall, following the sound as it moved around the perimeter of my temporary home. When I worked up the courage to peer through the window, I saw nothing but the ghostly outlines of trees swaying in moonlight. I grabbed my recorder, old habits die hard, and managed to capture about 30 seconds before the voices faded away. Playing it back through headphones, I could make out at least 3 distinct speakers, their words rising and falling in what might have been a chant or prayer. The quality was good enough to analyze later, though something about the rhythm made my chest feel tight with inexplicable dread. Sleep didn't come easy after that. Morning brought Joseph Clearwater right on schedule, his weathered pickup truck announcing itself long before it came into view. He was a man in his 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a traditional braid and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. When he stepped out of his truck and surveyed my campsite, his expression grew troubled. "You picked a strange place to park," he said without preamble. "The clearing was perfect for the RV. Why?" Is there something wrong with this spot? Joseph walked slowly around my vehicle, occasionally stopping to examine the ground or touch the bark of nearby trees. This is where they found Tommy Matsuki in 1987, he said finally. 3 days missing, wandering in circles, speaking languages no one recognized. He was never quite right after that. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What do you mean, never quite right? Sometimes he'd start talking to people who weren't there. Other times he'd know things, personal things about folks he'd never met. The doctors called it a breakdown, but we knew different. Joseph's gaze fixed on something behind me. The ancestors say this grove is a thin place, where our world touches others. Not all of what comes through is friendly. Despite my skepticism, I found myself glancing over my shoulder at the whispering pines. In daylight, they looked ordinary enough. Tall, ancient trees with bark scarred by centuries of weather. But there was something about the way they stood, the careful spacing between trunks, that suggested intentional arrangement rather than natural growth. I'd like to record some of the traditional stories, I said, pulling out my equipment. Stories about the entities you mentioned. Joseph studied the recorder for a long moment before nodding. I'll tell you what I can. But some things can't be captured by your machines. And some things shouldn't be. We spent the next 2 hours recording. Joseph's voice carried the weight of oral tradition as he spoke about the skin stealers, beings that existed in the spaces between human understanding. According to his people's beliefs, they were ancient entities that had learned to mimic human form and behavior, though imperfectly. They were drawn to people carrying emotional wounds, particularly guilt and regret, which they could smell like blood in the water. They whisper first, Joseph explained, his voice dropping to barely above a murmur, calling in voices you recognize, voices of people you've wronged or lost. If you follow the whispers, you give them permission to come closer. And once they're close enough, he left the sentence hanging. What happens then? They put on your skin, walk out of the forest wearing your face, living your life. The real you becomes the whisper in the trees, calling to the next lost soul. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the voices from the night before. Have there been recent incidents? Joseph's expression grew grim. 3 hikers went missing last month. 2 were found eventually, or things wearing their faces were. The families welcomed them home, but neighbors noticed changes. Small things at first. The way they moved, the way they spoke. Food they'd loved becoming suddenly repulsive. Loved ones they no longer recognized. And the 3rd hiker? Still out there, still calling. As if summoned by our conversation, a voice drifted from the direction of the whispering pines, distant but unmistakably human, crying out for help. Joseph went rigid, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his folding chair. We need to leave, he said, already standing. Now. But I was already reaching for my recorder, journalist instincts overriding common sense. The voice came again, clearer this time. A woman's voice, desperate and afraid. Every rational part of my brain said to listen to Joseph, to pack up and drive away from this place. But the part of me that had spent 15 years chasing stories, the part that needed this podcast to succeed, wouldn't let me walk away from what could be the recording of a lifetime. It could be someone genuinely in trouble, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Joseph grabbed my arm with surprising strength. That's what they want you to think. The voice always sounds like someone who needs help. That's how they draw you in. The woman's voice came a 3rd time, closer now, and with it came something that made my blood freeze. I recognized it. The cadence, the slight rasp from years of smoking. It was Sarah's voice. My ex-wife, calling my name with the same desperate tone she'd used during our last fight, when I'd walked out instead of trying to work things through. Marcus, please, I need help. I'm lost. Joseph saw the recognition in my face and his grip tightened. It's not her. Whatever you're hearing, whoever you think is calling, it's not them. But logic and terror were at war in my chest. What if it really was Sarah? What if she'd somehow followed me here, gotten lost in the woods while trying to... What? Reconcile? Yell at me some more? The woman's voice, Sarah's voice, called again, and this time I could hear panic creeping in. "I have to check," I said, pulling free from Joseph's grasp. "Then you're already lost." I grabbed my recorder and flashlight, Joseph's warnings echoing behind me as I pushed into the tree line. The voice continued to call, always just out of sight, always moving deeper into the forest. Branches caught at my clothes and scraped my face as I followed what might have been a deer trail through the undergrowth. Behind me, I could hear Joseph's truck starting up, the sound growing fainter as I ventured further into the woods. The voice led me in a winding path between massive tree trunks, through clearings carpeted with ferns, across streams that babbled with a sound almost like laughter. Each time I thought I was getting close, the voice would come from a new direction, maintaining a consistent distance that should have been my first clue that something was wrong. But I was running on adrenaline and misplaced guilt, convinced that somehow this was Sarah, that somehow I had a chance to fix what I'd broken. It wasn't until I looked back and realized I could no longer see my RV, or any trace of the clearing where I'd left it, that the first tendrils of real fear began to wrap around my spine. "Sarah?" I called, my voice embarrassingly small in the vast silence. "Where are you?" The response came from directly behind me. "Right here, Marcus." I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the gathering dusk, and saw her. Sarah stood maybe 20 feet away, wearing the same blue flannel shirt she'd had on the day I moved out. Her dark hair fell across her face the way it always did when she was upset, and her brown eyes held the same mixture of hurt and anger that had become so familiar during our last months together. But something was wrong with the picture. The details were all correct, but they felt like a photograph someone had tried to recreate from memory. Her skin was too pale, almost translucent in the flashlight beam. Her movements were slightly off, like someone learning to walk in an unfamiliar body. And when she smiled, that same sad smile that had broken my heart 100 times, her teeth seemed too sharp, too many. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice carrying that familiar rasp but lacking the warmth that had once made me feel like I was home. "We need to talk." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the forest floor. This was Sarah, or something wearing her face with terrifying accuracy. Even knowing it couldn't be real, couldn't be her, I found myself drawn forward by the gravitational pull of unfinished business. "Sarah, what are you doing here? How did you find me?" She tilted her head at an angle that was almost Sarah, but not quite, like a portrait painted by someone who had never seen her move. "You called me here, Marcus. All that guilt, all that pain you carry, it's like a beacon." The thing wearing Sarah's face took a step closer, and I caught a smell that definitely didn't belong to my ex-wife. Something like rotting leaves and stagnant water, organic decay masked by the familiar scent of her perfume. "You left me," she said, and her voice carried hurt that felt real enough to cut. "You walked away when I needed you most, when we could have fixed things. That was the hook, wasn't it? The thing that had been eating at me for months. The reason I'd ended up divorced and unemployed and running toward increasingly desperate schemes to rebuild my life. I had walked away. During our last fight, when Sarah had been crying and begging me to stay and work things out, I'd grabbed my keys and left. By the time I came back the next morning, she was gone, and the papers were filed within a week. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words torn from some wounded place in my chest. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I should have stayed. I should have fought for us." The thing smiled wider, and in the flashlight beam I could see that her teeth were definitely wrong. Too pointed, too many, arranged in rows like a shark's mouth. But her eyes still held Sarah's particular shade of brown, and when she reached out her hand, her fingers bore the same small scar she'd gotten from a broken bottle when we were cleaning out her mother's house. "You can make it up to me," she said, her voice shifting slightly, becoming something between Sarah's familiar tones and something else entirely. "Come with me. We can be together again." I took a step back, some survival instinct finally overriding my guilt-driven paralysis. "You're not Sarah. How can you say that? After everything we meant to each other, how can you doubt who I am?" But even as she spoke, her form was becoming less stable, like a television signal flickering in and out of focus. One moment she was Sarah down to the freckle on her left shoulder that only I knew about. The next, she was something else entirely. Tall and thin with 2 long limbs and eyes that reflected light like an animal's. I turned and ran. Behind me, the thing that had been wearing Sarah's face let out a sound that started as a sob and ended as something between a growl and a laugh. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush following what I hoped was the path back to my RV. But the forest seemed to have rearranged itself while I wasn't looking. Trails led to dead ends. Clearings opened into thicker tangles of brush, and no matter which direction I chose, I never seemed to get any closer to the familiar sound of my generator. The voices started again as full darkness fell. Not just Sarah's voice now, but others. My father, who'd died when I was 12, calling my name with the same disappointed tone he'd used when I'd disappointed him. My college roommate Jake, laughing about some shared joke from 20 years ago. My old editor from the newspaper, offering me my job back if I'd just come to where he was standing. Each voice was perfect, carrying emotional weight that hit me like physical blows. These were people I'd lost, people I'd failed, people I'd wronged. And they all wanted to talk, wanted me to follow their voices deeper into the maze of trees where the darkness was so complete, my flashlight beam seemed to die just inches from the lens. I stumbled through the forest for what felt like hours, following game trails that led nowhere, calling out for Joseph or anyone who might be real. My recorder, still clutched in my sweaty palm, continued to capture everything. The voices, my labored breathing, the sound of branches breaking under my feet. If I ever made it out of here, I'd have documentation of my own descent into madness. That's when I saw the light. A warm, golden glow filtered through the trees ahead, steady and welcoming. It looked like firelight, and where there was fire, there might be people. Real people. Not the things that had been calling my name in borrowed voices. I pushed toward the light, hope giving strength to my exhausted legs. I emerged into a small clearing where a campfire crackled cheerfully in a ring of stones. Sitting around the fire were 3 people, a middle-aged couple and a young woman, all dressed in hiking gear. They looked up as I stumbled out of the tree line, their faces showing concern and welcome. "Jesus, are you okay?" The man stood up, reaching out as if to steady me. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm lost," I gasped, relief flooding through me at the sight of other human beings. "My RV is parked somewhere near here, but I can't find it. There are things in the woods, voices." "Hey, it's okay," the woman said, her voice gentle and reassuring. "You're safe now. Why don't you sit down, catch your breath?" I accepted their invitation gratefully, sinking onto a log they'd positioned near the fire. The warmth felt wonderful after hours of stumbling through cold forest air. The couple introduced themselves as Bill and Janet, retired teachers from Portland who'd been camping in the area for decades. The young woman was their niece, Kelly, a college student majoring in environmental science. "We heard you crashing around out there," Bill said, handing me a cup of something hot that tasted like coffee mixed with whiskey. "Sounded like you were having a rough time of it." I told them about getting lost while following what I thought was a person in distress, carefully leaving out the supernatural elements. They listened sympathetically, Janet making appropriate concerned noises while Kelly fed more wood to the fire. "This area can be tricky," Janet said. "Lots of old logging roads that don't connect to anything anymore. Easy to get turned around, especially at night." "The thing is," I said, taking another sip of the fortifying drink, "I could have sworn I heard voices, people calling for help." The 3 of them exchanged glances across the fire, and I caught something in their expressions that made my newly found sense of security begin to waver. "What kind of voices?" Kelly asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Different people, someone I knew, asking for help." I studied their faces in the firelight, noting how the flames seemed to reflect differently in their eyes than they should have. "You haven't heard anything like that, have you?" Bill smiled, and in the dancing light of the fire his teeth looked wrong. Too many, too sharp, arranged in rows that human mouths weren't designed to hold. "Oh, yes," he said, his voice beginning to shift and change, taking on the cadence of my father's disappointed lectures. We hear voices all the time. Janet's face was melting, features running together like warm wax, reforming into the face of my old editor. Especially voices of people who have unfinished business, she said in his familiar gravelly tones. Kelly was changing too, her young features aging rapidly, taking on the lines and expressions of my college girlfriend Lisa, the one I'd cheated on and never properly apologized to. People who carry guilt like you do, Marcus, she said in Lisa's voice. It's like a dinner bell for us. I shot to my feet, the cup falling from nerveless fingers to shatter against the stones. The things around the fire were fully transformed now, wearing the faces of everyone I'd ever wronged or lost, their forms shifting and flickering like the flames themselves. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. "We want what we've always wanted," said the thing wearing my father's face. "For you to stop running, to face what you've done, to come home." They stood as one, moving with that same slightly off coordination I'd noticed in the Sarah thing. As they approached, their features continued to shift and blend, sometimes showing me faces I recognized, sometimes revealing glimpses of what they really were underneath. Pale, elongated forms with too many joints and eyes that reflected light like pools of oil. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it at the nearest one, the one that had been Kelly. It recoiled with a hiss, its false face melting away to reveal something with smooth, translucent skin and a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth. "Fire," I gasped, understanding flooding through me. "You don't like fire." I backed toward the edge of the clearing, torch held out in front of me like a sword. The things followed but kept their distance, circling like wolves while maintaining a careful buffer between themselves and the flames. "You can't run forever, Marcus," the father thing said, its voice layered with harmonics that made my teeth ache. "We know where you live. We know everyone you've ever hurt. We can be any of them. We are any of them," added the editor thing, grinning with a mouth that split its face from ear to ear. "Every person you've wronged, every relationship you've destroyed, every opportunity you've wasted. We are the weight of your failures made manifest." I reached the tree line and plunged back into the forest, the torch lighting my way through the maze of trunks and branches. Behind me, I could hear them following. Not running, but maintaining that steady, implacable pace that suggested they had all the time in the world. The torch burned lower as I stumbled through the darkness, its light growing dimmer with each passing minute. I tried to conserve it, holding it close to my body and using its glow sparingly to navigate around obstacles. But I could feel the heat creeping closer to my hand, and I knew I didn't have much time before I'd be left in complete darkness with those things. That's when I heard the familiar hum of my RV's generator. The sound was faint, almost lost in the whisper of wind through the trees, but it was definitely there. A steady mechanical drone that meant civilization and safety. I pushed toward it, following the sound through a gap between two massive Douglas firs and into the clearing where I'd parked what felt like a lifetime ago. The RV sat exactly where I'd left it, windows glowing warmly in the darkness, generator chugging away reassuringly. I'd never been so happy to see 24 feet of aluminum and fiberglass in my life. I sprinted for the door, torch still clutched in my left hand, and had my key in the lock when I heard Sarah's voice behind me. "Marcus, wait." I turned, knowing I shouldn't but unable to stop myself. She stood at the edge of the clearing, looking exactly as she had the day I'd moved out, hurt, confused, and heartbreakingly beautiful. No obvious signs of the wrongness that had marked the others, no shark teeth or shifting features. Just Sarah, looking at me with eyes full of pain and love. "Please," she said, taking a careful step closer. "Can we talk? Really talk this time, without you running away?" My hand tightened on the door handle. Everything in me wanted to believe this was real, that somehow the actual Sarah had followed me here, that I had a chance to fix what I'd broken. But I'd learned enough in the past few hours to know better. "What's my middle name?" I asked. She smiled that sad, familiar smile. "Thomas, after your grandfather. What was the first song we danced to? The Way You Look Tonight. At Jenny's wedding. You were so nervous you stepped on my dress." Every answer was correct, every detail perfect. and that's how I knew it wasn't her. "Sarah never called me Marcus," I said, unlocking the RV door. "She always called me Mark. You got everything else right, but you missed that." The thing wearing Sarah's face stopped smiling. Its features began to shift and run, like a watercolor painting left in the rain. "Very good," it said in a voice that was no longer Sarah's, no longer even human. "But it doesn't matter. We know where you live, Marcus Thomas Reed. We know your mother's address, your sister's phone number, your favorite coffee shop in Seattle. We can be any of them. All of them." I slammed the RV door and threw the deadbolt, then moved quickly to check that all the windows were locked. Outside, I could hear more voices joining the first. A chorus of everyone I'd ever known, everyone I'd ever hurt, all calling my name in perfect reproduction of their original owners' voices. But I was safe inside the RV. I had walls, locks, light. I had my recorder with hours of documentation that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. I had. The generator cut out. Silence fell like a physical weight, broken only by the voices outside growing louder and more insistent. The lights flickered and died, leaving me in perfect darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its screen light to navigate to the manual generator controls, but the switch that should have restarted it did nothing. A soft, scratching sound came from the roof. Then another, from the opposite side. Then more, as if something was walking around up there, testing for weak spots. The voices outside had stopped calling my name and were now whispering in languages I didn't recognize, the words seeming to seep through the walls themselves. I grabbed my phone and called 911, but got only a recording saying the number was out of service. No signal bars showed on the screen. Of course there wouldn't be. I was miles from the nearest cell tower, in a dead zone that made communication with the outside world impossible. The scratching on the roof intensified, and I heard the distinct sound of metal being peeled back. They were trying to get in through the roof vent, their claws or whatever they used for hands finding purchase on the aluminum and tearing it like paper. I had to get out of here. The keys were still in my pocket and the RV's engine was separate from the generator. If I could get to the driver's seat and start it up, I could drive out of here, back to the main road, back to civilization where these things couldn't follow. I felt my way to the front of the RV in complete darkness, guided by memory and the faint outline of windows against the lesser darkness outside. The scratching sounds were directly overhead now, accompanied by rhythmic tearing that suggested they were making good progress on their entry attempt. My hand found the driver's seat and I slid behind the wheel. The key turned easily, and the engine coughed to life with a roar that sounded like salvation itself. I threw it into drive and pressed the accelerator, feeling the big vehicle lurch forward into the darkness. For a moment, I thought I'd made it. The RV bounced and rocked as I navigated the rough track leading out of the clearing, headlights cutting through the forest and showing me the way home. The scratching sounds from the roof had stopped, and I allowed myself to hope that whatever those things were, they couldn't keep up with a moving vehicle. Then I saw the tree. It lay directly across the track about 50 yards ahead, a massive Douglas fir that definitely hadn't been there when I drove in. The trunk was easily 4 feet in diameter, far too large for the RV to push through or climb over. I hit the brakes, bringing the vehicle to a shuddering stop just inches from the barrier. As if the tree had been a signal, the voices started again. Not from outside the RV this time, but from inside it. From the speakers of my radio, my phone, even the smoke detector. A cacophony of familiar voices all speaking at once, telling me to come out, to stop running, to face what I'd done. And underneath it all, barely audible but definitely there, was the sound of my own voice, speaking words I'd never said, making promises I'd never made, apologizing for things I hadn't done yet. The scratching resumed on the roof, but now it was accompanied by similar sounds from the sides of the RV, as if multiple entities were working their way through the aluminum walls. I could smell something burning. Not fire, but the acrid scent of heated metal being melted or dissolved. I was trapped. The thing about terror is that it doesn't last forever. Eventually, your body runs out of adrenaline. Your mind reaches its capacity for panic, and a strange calm settles over you. That's what happened to me as I sat in the driver's seat. listening to the sounds of inhuman things cutting their way into my temporary sanctuary. I was going to die here. Or worse, something was going to take my skin and walk out of these woods wearing my face, living my life, disappointing my family and friends in ways I'd never had the chance to disappoint them myself. But first, I was going to finish what I'd started. I felt my way back to where I'd left my recording equipment, guided by muscle memory and the growing intensity of the sounds above me. My fingers found the recorder, still running, still capturing everything. The battery indicator showed nearly full. I'd have enough power to document whatever happened next. The first hole appeared in the ceiling just as I started speaking. This is Marcus Reed, September 21st, approximately 11:30 p.m. I'm trapped in my RV in the Olympic National Forest, surrounded by entities that I can only describe as skin stealers. They've taken the forms of people from my past, people I've wronged or lost, and they're currently breaking into my vehicle. A clawed hand pushed through the hole in the ceiling, followed by an arm that was too long, too pale, with joints that bent the wrong way. I kept talking, my voice surprisingly steady as more holes appeared in the walls around me. For anyone who finds this recording, and I hope someone does, I want you to know that these things feed on guilt and regret. They know your secrets, your failures, your deepest emotional wounds. They'll use that knowledge against you, appearing as the people you most want to see, offering you the conversations you most need to have. Another hand burst through the wall near my head, this one bearing the familiar scar pattern I'd memorized during 3 years of marriage. It reached for me with Sarah's delicate fingers, but the arm it was attached to belonged to something that had never been human. Don't listen to them, I continued, backing away from the grasping appendages. Don't follow their voices. Don't believe their promises. They're not the people you remember. They're something else, something that wears human skin like a costume. The entities were inside now, multiple forms flowing through the holes they'd created with fluid, unnatural movement. In the dim light from my phone screen, I could see them taking shape. My father, Sarah, my editor, my college girlfriend, my high school English teacher who'd believed in me when no one else did. All of them perfect, all of them wrong. "Marcus," my father said in his familiar voice, "you're scaring us. Put down the recorder and come with us. We just want to help." "We love you," Sarah added, her form flickering between the woman I'd married and something with too many teeth. "We forgive you for everything, for leaving, for giving up, for all of it. But you have to come with us." They surrounded me, reaching out with hands that looked human but felt wrong when they touched my skin. Cold, slightly damp with a texture like mushrooms left too long in the refrigerator. "The guilt you carry," my editor said in his gravelly voice, "it's eating you alive. We can take it away. All the pain, all the regret, all the ways you failed. We can make it stop." And the terrible thing was, part of me wanted to believe them. Part of me was so tired of carrying the weight of my mistakes that the promise of release was almost irresistible. It would be so easy to stop fighting, to let them take me wherever they wanted to go, to become whatever they wanted me to become. But I held on to the recorder like a lifeline, continuing to speak into it even as their hands pulled at my clothes and hair. They offer relief from guilt, but it's a lie. The only way to deal with guilt is to face it, to own it, to try to make amends when possible and forgive yourself when it's not. Running doesn't work. Hiding doesn't work. And whatever these things are offering, it's not healing, it's consumption. The Sarah thing leaned close, its breath warm against my ear. "You always were stubborn," it whispered. "But that's okay. We have time. All the time in the world." Then they were dragging me toward the holes they'd made, their false faces smiling with too many teeth, their eyes reflecting my phone's light like mirrors. I fought, but there were too many of them, and they were stronger than they looked. That's when I remembered the torch. The burning branch I'd used earlier had fallen to the floor when I'd climbed into the driver's seat. It was probably cold by now, but the wood itself might still be smoldering. Fire was the only thing I'd seen them react to with genuine fear. I twisted in their grip, reaching desperately for where I thought the branch had fallen. My fingers found it just as they started pulling me through the largest hole in the wall. The wood was cold, seemingly dead, but when I blew on what I hoped was the ember end, a faint glow appeared. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every entity recoiled as if I'd brandished a poisonous snake, their perfect human features melting away to reveal the pale, elongated forms underneath. In the growing light from the rekindled torch, I could see them clearly for the first time. Beings that seemed to be made of shadow and starlight, with skin like moonlight on water and eyes that held depths I didn't want to explore. I blew harder on the ember, coaxing it back to life, and the creatures retreated further. But they didn't flee. Instead, they formed a circle around me, just outside the reach of the torch's light, and began to speak in unison. "You cannot burn forever, Marcus Reed. The wood will be consumed, the flame will die, and we will still be here. We are patient. We are eternal. And you are already ours." They were right, of course. The torch would burn for maybe an hour if I was careful with it. After that, I'd be defenseless again. But an hour was long enough to finish what I'd started. I spoke into the recorder, describing what I could see in the torchlight, documenting the entity's true forms and their reaction to fire. If someone found this recording, when someone found it, they'd have information that might save other lives. "Fire seems to be their weakness," I said, keeping the torch moving in slow arcs to hold them at bay. "They can't tolerate direct flame, though I don't know if it actually hurts them or just forces them to reveal their true nature. The illusions they create are incredibly detailed, but they have tells, small inconsistencies in behavior or memory that give them away." The circle of entities began to move, flowing around me like smoke given form. Their voices rose in that inhuman harmony I'd heard before, words in languages that predated human speech. "They seem to be conducting some kind of ritual," I continued. "I can't understand the words, but the rhythm suggests a summoning or binding of some kind. The sound it's getting inside my head, making it hard to think clearly." And it was. The chanting created a resonance in my skull, like standing too close to massive speakers. My vision blurred, and for moments at a time I forgot where I was, forgot why I was holding a torch, forgot everything except the hypnotic rhythm of their voices. But I kept talking into the recorder, using my own voice as an anchor to reality. The chanting affects human consciousness, creates disorientation, memory loss. I think this is how they prepare their victims. Break down mental defenses before the final assault. The torch was burning lower now, the flame flickering dangerously close to my fingers. Soon, I'd have to drop it or risk serious burns. The entities seemed to sense this, their circle tightening incrementally, their chanting growing more intense. "If anyone finds this recording," I said, speaking faster now as the flame danced closer to my hand, "stay away from the Whispering Pines area of Olympic National Forest. Don't camp alone. Don't follow voices in the darkness, no matter how familiar they sound. And if you hear chanting, run. Don't try to investigate, don't try to record it, just run." The flame reached my fingers and I had to drop the torch. It hit the RV's floor and rolled, the ember end coming to rest against a pile of papers that caught immediately. Within seconds, small fires were blooming throughout the confined space as the flames found fuel. Curtains, upholstery, the thin wood paneling that lined the walls. The entities shrieked in harmony, a sound like glass breaking combined with the dying screams of 1,000 animals. They retreated toward the holes they'd made, but the fire was spreading faster than they could move. Smoke began to fill the RV, and I realized with sudden clarity that I was about to burn to death in my own desperate gambit. But maybe that was better than whatever they had planned for me. The smoke was getting thick now, making it hard to breathe. I could barely see the recorder in my hand, but I held it close to my mouth and kept talking. "The fire is working. They're retreating. But I'm trapped in here with it. If this is how it ends, at least I documented what happened. At least someone will know." Through the smoke and flames, I caught glimpses of the entities trying to escape through their entry points. But fire had spread to the walls around the holes, creating barriers they couldn't cross. They were trapped in here with me, and their inhuman shrieks were getting more desperate by the second. That's when I saw the door. In my panic, I'd forgotten that the RV's main door was still unlocked, still accessible. The fire hadn't reached that part of the vehicle yet, though smoke was beginning to pour through the gaps around it. If I could reach it, if I could get outside. I crawled toward the door on hands and knees, staying below the worst of the smoke, the recorder still clutched in one hand. Behind me, I could hear the entity's cries growing fainter as the fire consumed whatever physical forms they'd managed to manifest. The door handle was hot but not yet burning. I yanked it open and tumbled out into the blessed cool air of the forest night. The RV was fully ablaze now, flames shooting through the roof vents and holes the entities had made. In the fire's light, I could see the tree that had blocked my escape route was gone. Either it had never been real, or whatever power had placed it there was no longer functioning. I staggered away from the burning vehicle, coughing smoke from my lungs, still gripping the recorder like a talisman. The forest around me was silent again. No voices, no whispers, no inhuman chanting. Just the crackle of flames and the distant sound of the Saul Duke River. My truck was parked about 100 yards away where Joseph had left it after deciding I was beyond help. The keys were on the ground beside the driver's door, dropped in his haste to escape. I climbed behind the wheel with shaking hands and started the engine. As I drove away from the burning wreckage of my RV, I caught movement in the rearview mirror. Shapes moving in the fire's light. Tall, pale figures with too many joints dancing in the flames like moths drawn to destruction. Whether they were burning or celebrating, I couldn't tell. I drove through the night without stopping, following logging roads and fire access routes until I hit Highway 101. Dawn was breaking over the Pacific when I finally pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner in Port Angeles. My hands were still shaking as I ordered coffee and called the Forest Service to report the fire. They found the burned wreckage of my RV exactly where I'd left it, along with evidence of the entity's forced entry, claw marks in the aluminum, holes torn through the roof and walls with surgical precision. The official report blamed the fire on a generator malfunction. The holes on bears attracted by food smells. They asked me about the strange acoustic properties of my recording equipment, which had somehow captured voices and sounds that shouldn't have been audible at such distances. I told them it was just electronic interference, atmospheric distortion caused by the fire. They seemed satisfied with that explanation, but I kept the recording. I've listened to it hundreds of times since that night, analyzing every second, trying to understand what I encountered in those woods. The voices are all there. Sarah, my father, all the others, captured with perfect clarity. But underneath their familiar tones, if you listen carefully with good headphones, you can hear something else. Harmonics that human vocal cords can't produce. Subsonic frequencies that make your teeth ache and your vision blur. I never finished the podcast. How could I? What station would air it? What audience would believe it? Instead, I went back to journalism, got a job with a small paper in eastern Washington, as far from the Olympic Peninsula as I could manage while staying in the state. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear whispers from the walls. Familiar voices calling my name, asking me to come outside, promising we can finally have that conversation I've been avoiding. I don't answer them anymore. I've learned that some conversations aren't worth having, some guilt isn't worth purging, and some legends exist for very good reasons. The recording sits in a safety deposit box now, along with written documentation of everything that happened that night. If something happens to me, if I'm found missing, or if someone wearing my face shows up acting strangely, maybe someone will know where to look for answers, because I don't think they're done with me. I carry too much guilt, too much regret, too many unresolved wounds for them to simply give up. They're patient, as they said, eternal. And somewhere in the deep woods of the Olympic Peninsula, in a grove of ancient trees that whisper in languages older than human speech, they're waiting for me to make another mistake. They're waiting for me to come home. End of recording. Marcus Reed's body was found 3 months after this account was written, discovered by hikers in the Whispering Pines Grove of Olympic National Forest. He appeared to have died of exposure, though the circumstances were unusual. He was found sitting upright against a tree, as if he'd simply decided to rest and never woken up. His notebook containing this account was clutched in his hands, along with a digital recorder that held no audio files. The hikers who found him reported hearing voices calling for help as they approached the grove. Voices that sounded exactly like Marcus Reed calling their names. When they investigated, they found only his body and a Forest Service ranger who claimed to be conducting a routine patrol. The ranger's credentials checked out, but 2 weeks later, the real ranger was found at his home, where he'd been dead for over a month. Marcus Reed was seen boarding a bus in Seattle the day after his body was discovered. Security footage shows him buying a ticket to Portland under his own name, but the footage is corrupted by strange audio interference that sounds almost like whispering. He has not been seen since. The Whispering Pines Grove has been closed to the public indefinitely. Story 2. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 28, and the first scream I heard at Devil's Den State Park in Arkansas sounded like mine. The memory hits me in fragments now, 3 months later, as I sit in this sterile hospital room watching the fog press against my window. Dr. Martinez says the gaps in my memory are normal after trauma, that they might come back gradually. But there are things I remember with crystalline clarity that I wish I could forget, and things I can't remember at all that might explain why I wake up every night at 3:17 a.m. with the taste of copper in my mouth. We'd driven down from Kansas City in Marcus's new Winnebago, Marcus, my boyfriend of 2 years, and his college roommate Jake with Jake's girlfriend Amy. It was supposed to be a long weekend to celebrate Marcus finally finishing his engineering degree. Amy had found Devil's Den online, said it looked rustic and authentic with its sandstone bluffs and old-growth forest. The photos showed pristine hiking trails winding through dense woodland, a creek that ran clear and cold, and campsites tucked away from civilization. What the photos didn't show was how the trees seemed to lean inward as you drove deeper into the park, or how the shadows fell wrong even in daylight, pooling in places where the sun should have reached. Marcus laughed when I mentioned it, said I'd been watching too many horror movies. Jake, sprawled across the dinette with his laptop, didn't look up from whatever game he was playing. Amy just smiled that patient smile she wore whenever anyone said something she deemed dramatic. The campground host, an elderly man named Roy with skin like old leather and eyes the color of creek water, handed us our site assignment with hands that shook slightly. Site 23, he said. Back in the woods where you won't be bothered by the day hikers. Real peaceful back there. When I asked about the trails, he paused, studying my face like he was trying to memorize it. Stick to the marked paths, he said finally, and if the fog rolls in, you just stay put until it clears. No matter what you hear out there. I wanted to ask what he meant, but Marcus was already revving the engine, eager to get set up before dark. As we pulled away, I saw Roy in the side mirror, still standing in his doorway, still watching us go. Site 23 sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through increasingly dense forest. The trees here were different from the ones near the entrance. Older, thicker, with bark that looked almost black in the fading light. They crowded close to the narrow road, branches scraping against the RV's sides with a sound like fingernails on metal. The campsite itself was a small clearing surrounded by towering oaks and maples, their canopy so thick that even with the sun still up, the space felt dim and enclosed. A fire ring sat in the center, filled with cold ashes that looked undisturbed for months. A weathered picnic table tilted slightly to one side, and a small creek burbled somewhere beyond the tree line. Perfect, Amy declared, snapping photos with her phone. This is exactly what I had in mind. So authentic. Jake emerged from the RV, stretching and looking around with the casual interest of someone who spent most of his time indoors. No cell service, he announced, holding up his phone. Total digital detox. Just what the doctor ordered. I checked my own phone. He was right. No bars, no data. The feeling of being cut off hit me harder than I expected. A flutter of anxiety in my chest that I pushed down. I was being ridiculous. People had been camping for thousands of years without cell phones. Marcus was already busy leveling the RV and hooking up the utilities, moving with the focused efficiency he brought to any mechanical task. I loved watching him work, the way his hands moved with such confidence and precision. He caught me staring and grinned. "Help me get this stabilized, and then we can start the fire," he said. "I brought those good bratwurst from the German deli." We spent the next hour setting up camp, extending the awning, arranging the camp chairs around the fire ring, stringing lights between the trees. Amy found wildflowers growing near the creek and made a centerpiece for the picnic table. Jake located the breaker panel and got the external outlets working so he could charge his devices overnight. Normal, mundane tasks that should have felt comfortable and familiar. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not by animals. I would have expected to see squirrels or birds, maybe a deer picking its way through the underbrush. The forest around us was completely silent except for the creek and the whisper of wind through leaves. No bird calls, no rustle of small creatures moving through the undergrowth. Even the insects seemed muted, their usual evening chorus reduced to an occasional, half-hearted chirp. As the sun set and shadows deepened between the trees, Marcus got the fire started. The flames cast dancing light across our small circle, pushing back the darkness but somehow making the forest beyond seem even more impenetrable. Amy produced a bottle of wine, and Jake broke out a deck of cards. We fell into the easy rhythm of vacation. Stories about work, plans for the future, gentle teasing, and shared laughter. But underneath the normalcy, something felt off. Maybe it was the way the fire seemed to burn differently here, the flames reaching higher than they should have, flickering in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Or maybe it was how our voices sounded flat and strange, as if the trees were absorbing the sound before it could carry properly. Around 10 p.m., Amy announced she was getting tired and headed into the RV to get ready for bed. The rest of us stayed around the fire, finishing the wine and watching the flames dance. That's when Marcus mentioned the fog. "Look at that," he said, pointing toward the creek. "Coming in fast." I turned to look and felt my stomach drop. A wall of fog was rolling through the trees toward us, thick and white and moving far too quickly to be natural. It flowed like water, spilling around tree trunks and pooling in the low places. But there was something purposeful about its movement, as if it were seeking something. "Weird," Jake said, but he sounded more interested than concerned. "Never seen fog move like that." The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. The fog reached the edge of our campsite and stopped, forming a perfect circle around us. Beyond its white wall, the forest had vanished completely. We might have been floating in space for all we could see. "Should we wake Amy?" I asked, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. "Let her sleep," Marcus said. "It's just weather. Pretty cool, actually." But it wasn't just weather. Even Jake seemed to sense it now, setting down his cards and staring into the white wall that surrounded us. The fog didn't move randomly like normal fog should. It held its position with an unnatural stillness, and occasionally, I could swear I saw shapes moving within it. Tall, dark figures that appeared for a moment and then melted back into the white. That's when we heard the first scream. It came from somewhere in the fog, distant but clear. A sound of pure terror that raised every hair on my arms. Human, definitely human, and definitely female. The three of us froze around the fire, straining to listen. "What the hell was that?" Jake whispered. Before anyone could answer, we heard it again, closer this time. A woman's voice, screaming for help. The sound raw and desperate, and underneath it, something else. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Marcus was on his feet, grabbing the flashlight from the table. "Someone's in trouble." "Wait," I said, catching his arm. "Roy said to stay put if the fog came in. He said not to go out there no matter what we heard." "That's a person screaming, Sarah. We can't just sit here." The scream came again, and this time I could make out words. "Help me. Please, someone help me." Jake stood up too, his face pale in the firelight. "She sounds really close. Maybe just to the edge of the fog?" They were going to go. I could see it in their faces, that male instinct to rush toward danger when someone was calling for help. And maybe they were right. Maybe it was just a lost hiker who had gotten turned around in the fog. But when the scream came again, I realized something that made my blood run cold. It sounded exactly like my own voice. "Don't," I said, gripping Marcus's arm tighter. "Something's wrong. That doesn't sound right." "Of course it doesn't sound right," Marcus said gently. "The poor woman is terrified. We have to try to help." He kissed my forehead and stepped toward the fog wall, Jake close behind him. The white wall seemed to pulse slightly as they approached, and for a moment I could swear I saw something dark and tall moving just beyond its surface. "Marcus, please," I called after him, but he was already disappearing into the white. The beam of his flashlight swallowed up almost instantly. I sat alone by the fire, listening to their footsteps fade into silence. The fog pressed closer, and I could feel its cold breath on my skin. Somewhere in the distance I could hear Marcus calling out, "Hello? We're here to help. Where are you?" Then silence. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time seemed to move strangely in that white cocoon. The fire burned lower, and I fed it more wood with shaking hands. Amy was still asleep in the RV, and I found myself grateful for that. Whatever was happening out there, at least she was safe inside. When Marcus screamed, it was nothing like the woman's voice we'd heard before. This was pure agony, a sound I'd never heard him make, a sound I hadn't known he was capable of making. It went on, echoing strangely in the fog, and then cut off abruptly. I was on my feet before I realized I'd moved, every instinct screaming at me to run to him. But Roy's words held me back. "Don't matter what you hear out there." Jake's voice came next, calling Marcus's name, moving through the fog in what sounded like circles. "Marcus! Marcus, where are you? Sarah, can you hear me?" I opened my mouth to answer and then stopped, because Jake's voice was coming from two different directions at once. One voice called from my left, near where they'd entered the fog. "Sarah, Sarah, we found her. Come help us." The other came from my right, fainter but definitely Jake. Don't listen to it. It's not. Oh, God. Marcus, what happened to your face?" My legs gave out and I collapsed back into my chair. The fog swirled closer, and now I could definitely see shapes moving within it. Tall, dark figures that walked on two long legs and turned their heads at angles that hurt to look at. "Sarah!" The Jake voice from the left called again. "We need your help. She's hurt bad." But I'd heard the terror in the other voice, the one that cut off mid-sentence with a wet, choking sound. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed by indecision and fear. The fog pressed against me from all sides, and I could hear voices calling from within it. Marcus's voice, Jake's voice, even Amy's voice, though she was still asleep in the RV behind me. They called my name, begged me to come help, promised they were safe and everything was fine. But underneath all those familiar voices was something else. A low, continuous growling that seemed to come from the fog itself, and occasionally a sound like wet meat being torn apart. When the fog finally began to lift, it happened as suddenly as it had arrived. One moment I was surrounded by white walls, the next I could see the dark shapes of trees emerging like islands from a receding tide. The fire had burned down to coals, and the first gray light of dawn was filtering through the canopy above. The campsite looked exactly as we'd left it. Chairs arranged around the fire ring, cards scattered on the picnic table, empty wine bottle glinting in the early light. But Marcus and Jake were gone. I called their names until my voice gave out, searched the immediate area until the rising sun made it clear that whatever had happened to them had happened somewhere beyond the reach of my flashlight. Their footprints led to the edge where the fog wall had been and simply stopped, as if they'd walked off the edge of the world. When Amy finally woke up and came stumbling out of the RV, rubbing her eyes and asking what all the noise was about, I tried to explain, tried to tell her about the fog and the voices and the terrible sounds in the white. She stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "What fog?" she said, looking around at the clear morning air. "And where are Marcus and Jake?" I brought her to where their footprints ended, showed her the place where they'd disappeared. But in the morning light, even I had to admit it looked like nothing more than ordinary forest floor. No footprints, no signs of disturbance, nothing to indicate that two grown men had vanished into thin air. Amy insisted we call for help, but there was still no cell service. We drove back to the ranger station where Roy took our report with the weary expression of a man who'd heard similar stories before. He called the state police, and within hours the woods were full of search teams with dogs and helicopters. They found nothing. No trace of Marcus or Jake. No sign of where they might have gone. The search went on for 3 days before being officially called off, though I know some of the local volunteers kept looking on their own time. That's when the interviews started. Police, FBI, Park Service investigators, all asking the same questions over and over. Where had they gone? Had there been any arguments? Any reason they might have wanted to disappear? Did I know about any debts, any trouble they might have been in? I told them about the fog, about the voices, about Roy's warning. Most of them listened politely and wrote nothing down. A few exchanged glances that said more than words ever could. The FBI agent, a tired-looking woman named Special Agent Brooks, was more direct. "Miss Chen," she said, "I've been doing this for 15 years. Men don't just vanish into thin air. Usually when someone disappears in circumstances like these, there's a very human explanation." She was suggesting I'd killed them, or that I knew who had. I could see it in her eyes, in the way she leaned forward when she asked certain questions, in the careful phrasing of her inquiries about my relationship with Marcus. But Roy believed me. I could see it in his face when he thought no one was looking, the way his eyes kept darting to the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. After the official search ended, he pulled me aside. "You're lucky," he said quietly. "Lucky you didn't follow them into that fog." "What happened to them?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the woods. "Same thing that happened to the others. Every few years, someone doesn't come back. Always when the fog rolls in like that. Always when it moves wrong." He turned to look at me, and his creekwater eyes held depths I didn't want to plumb. "Thing is, sometimes they do come back, but they ain't the same people who went in." Before I could ask what he meant, Amy appeared, ready to drive back to Kansas City. The police had released the RV, and she wanted to get home. Wanted to get away from the woods and the questions and the growing certainty that Marcus and Jake were never coming back. I should have stayed. Should have demanded more search teams, more time. Should have gone into those woods myself and kept looking until I found some trace of them. But the truth was, I was terrified. Terrified of the woods, terrified of the fog, terrified of what I might find if I looked too hard. So I left, drove back to Kansas City and tried to pick up the pieces of a life that no longer made sense. Answered phone calls from Marcus's parents, from Jake's sister, from friends who wanted to know how 2 healthy men could just disappear. Attended the memorial services they held when the official investigation concluded without answers. But mostly, I tried to forget. Tried to convince myself that Agent Brooks was right, that there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe Marcus and Jake had staged their own disappearance, some kind of quarter-life crisis that drove them to abandon their old lives and start fresh somewhere else. Maybe they'd fallen into an old well or mine shaft that the search teams had missed. Maybe they'd been murdered by someone who knew how to hide bodies where they'd never be found. I tried, but I couldn't shake the memory of those voices in the fog, the way Jake had sounded when he said, "Don't listen to it." The way that terrible growling had seemed to come from everywhere at once. The shapes I'd seen moving in the white, too tall and wrong to be human. 3 months later, I started having the dreams. They always begin the same way. I'm back at the campsite, sitting by the fire while fog rolls in from the creek. But in the dreams, I follow Marcus and Jake into the white. I walk through that wall of fog and into a place that isn't quite the Arkansas woods anymore. The trees are the same, but different. Their bark black as char. Their branches reaching toward a sky the color of old bone. The creek runs backward, flowing uphill with a sound like whispered secrets. And everywhere, moving between the twisted trunks, are the tall dark shapes I glimpsed through the fog that night. In the dreams, I find Marcus and Jake eventually. They're sitting around another campfire in a clearing that mirrors our own, roasting marshmallows and laughing like nothing has happened. But when they turn to look at me, their faces are wrong. Features rearranged like a puzzle put together by someone who'd never seen a human before. "Sarah!" Dream Marcus says, his mouth opening too wide, showing too many teeth. "We've been waiting for you. Come sit down." Dream Jake nods eagerly, his neck bending at an angle that should have snapped his spine. It's so much better here. No cell phones, no deadlines, no stress. Just us and the woods forever. And then they start screaming again. The same terrible sounds I heard that night, but their faces never change expression. They keep smiling those too wide smiles while the screams pour out of them like blood from an open wound. I always wake up at 3:17 a.m., covered in sweat and tasting copper. Doctor Martinez says the dreams are my mind's way of processing the trauma, that they'll fade with time and therapy. But they're not fading. If anything, they're getting more vivid, more detailed. And lately, I've started to remember things that weren't in the dreams before, like the way the fog had smelled, not like normal fog, but like something rotting, something sweet and sick and wrong. Like the sound of breathing I'd heard coming from the RV while Amy was supposedly asleep, except it was too deep, too slow, like something much larger than a human trying to mimic human respiration. Like the moment, just before the fog lifted, when I'd turned to check on the RV and seen a face pressed against the small window. Amy's face, but wrong somehow. The features just slightly off, as if someone had tried to copy her from memory. But when she'd emerged that morning, rubbing her eyes and asking about the noise, she'd looked completely normal, had sounded completely normal, had acted exactly the way Amy always acted, with that same patient smile and slightly condescending tone. The face in the window haunts me more than the dreams do, because if what I remember is real, if that thing in the fog had somehow gotten to Amy while I sat paralyzed by the fire, then I'd driven back to Kansas City with something that wore her skin like a mask. Amy and I don't talk anymore. After the memorial services, after the last police interview, after the slow, painful process of dividing up Marcus's belongings, we'd simply drifted apart. She'd said she needed space to grieve, needed time to process what had happened. I'd understood. Hell, I'd felt the same way. But sometimes, late at night when the dreams wake me up, I find myself thinking about that face in the window. Thinking about all the little ways Amy had seemed different on the drive home. More talkative than usual, asking questions about Marcus's family that she should have already known the answers to. Humming songs I'd never heard her hum before. 3 weeks ago, I got a text from her. "Just checking in," it said. "Hope you're doing well. Thought we should get coffee soon. Catch up." I stared at that message for an hour before deleting it without responding, because the Amy I knew had never used phrases like "just checking in" or "catch up." She was more formal in her communications, more precise. And she'd never been one for unnecessary social contact. But mostly, I deleted it because of what happened to the phone afterward. The screen went black for just a moment, and when it flickered back to life, the message was different. Same contact name, same timestamp, but the words had changed. "I know you remember now. I know you saw me that night. We should get coffee soon and talk about what really happened in the woods." By the time I'd fumbled the phone to show Dr. Martinez at our next session, the message had changed back to the original. "Just checking in. Hope you're doing well." She suggested I was experiencing a hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation, prescribed stronger sleeping pills, and recommended I take some time off work. The pills didn't help. If anything, they made the dreams worse. More vivid, more real, harder to shake when I woke up. And the waking hours weren't much better. I started seeing things that couldn't be there. Marcus, standing at the end of my street, too far away to make out clearly but unmistakably him in the way he held his shoulders. Jake's laugh echoing from empty rooms. Fog rolling in through the gaps under doors even when the weather forecast called for clear skies. 2 weeks ago, I drove back to Devil's Den. I told myself I was going for closure, to face the place where my life had fallen apart and maybe find some peace. But really, I think I was going because the dreams had started bleeding into my waking hours, and I needed to know if any of it was real. Roy was still there, looking older and more tired than I remembered. He recognized me immediately, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been pity or might have been fear. Shouldn't have come back, he said, not unkindly. Some places, once they get their hooks in you, they don't let go easy. I asked him about the others he'd mentioned, the people who disappeared every few years. He was reluctant to talk at first, but eventually he opened up. A family from Oklahoma in 2018. Twin brothers from Memphis in 2015. A young couple from Little Rock in 2012. Always the same pattern. Fog rolling in too fast and too thick, voices calling from the white, people walking into the forest and never coming back. Sometimes, he said, echoing what he'd told me before, sometimes they do come back. But they ain't right. Move wrong, talk wrong, smell wrong, like something else wearing their skin. What happens to them? I asked. Roy was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the trees. Well, that depends. Sometimes they just disappear again after a few days, go back to wherever they came from. Sometimes, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes they try to live normal lives, get jobs, make friends, start families, but it never works out. They can copy the surface, but they can't copy the soul. People start to notice, start to ask questions, and then they usually head back to the woods, back home. I spent that night in a motel 20 miles away, afraid to camp but unable to leave without seeing the site one more time. The next morning, I drove back to Site 23. The campsite looked exactly the same. Same fire ring, same tilted picnic table, same dense canopy overhead. But walking into that clearing felt like stepping into a tomb. The air was wrong, too thick and too cold, carrying sense of decay and dampness that shouldn't have been there in the dry autumn weather. I stood in the center of the site and tried to remember exactly what had happened that night. Tried to recall every detail, every sound, every moment between the fog rolling in and the sun coming up. Most of it came back in fragments. The feeling of being watched, the voices calling from the white, the terrible sounds that might have been screaming or might have been something else entirely. But as I stood there, something new surfaced from the depths of my memory. Something I'd buried so deep I'd convinced myself it was just another nightmare. In those hours between Marcus and Jake disappearing and the fog lifting, I hadn't been alone by the fire. Something had emerged from the white, not walking, but flowing, like liquid shadow given form. It had circled the campsite just beyond the fire's light, and I'd felt its attention like weight on my skin. And then it had spoken, not with one voice, but with many, all layered together in a harmony that hurt to hear. We know you now, Sarah Chen. We know your smell, your taste, your fear. You belong to us now, whether you come willingly or not. I'd buried that memory so deep it had taken standing in the exact spot to bring it back. But now that it had surfaced, I couldn't push it down again. Couldn't pretend it was just trauma, or imagination, or stress-induced hallucination. They knew me. Whatever lived in those woods, whatever the fog brought with it, they knew who I was. And they were coming for me. The realization should have sent me running back to my car, back to Kansas City, back to the illusion of safety that distance might provide. Instead, I found myself walking toward the tree line, toward the place where the fog had first appeared. My feet moved without conscious direction, drawn by something I couldn't name or resist. The forest here was different from what I remembered. The trees seemed larger, their trunks twisted into shapes that suggested faces or reaching hands. The understory was too thick, too dark, filled with shadows that moved independently of any breeze. And underneath it all was a smell, sweet and sick and wrong, like flowers rotting in old water. I found their camp about a quarter-mile in. It was a perfect mirror of our own site, fire ring, picnic table, even an RV that was identical to Marcus's Winnebago. But everything was wrong, as if someone had tried to recreate our campsite from a description rather than memory. The fire ring was too large, the picnic table faced the wrong direction. The RV sat at an angle that would have made it impossible to level properly. And sitting around the fire, roasting marshmallows and laughing like nothing had happened, were Marcus and Jake. They looked up when I stepped into the clearing, and their faces lit up with the same warm smiles I remembered. But their eyes were wrong. Too bright, too knowing, reflecting light like an animal's eyes caught in headlights. "Sarah," Marcus said, jumping up to embrace me. His arms felt real enough, his warmth familiar, but underneath the surface, something writhed and shifted. "We've been waiting for you. We knew you'd come back eventually." Jake nodded eagerly, his movements too fluid, his neck bending at angles that should have been uncomfortable. "It's so much better here. No stress, no deadlines, no worries about the future. Just us and the woods and all the time in the world." I stood frozen as they gathered around me, their hands reaching out to touch my arms, my face, my hair. Their skin felt wrong, too warm, too soft, like it might give way under pressure and reveal something else underneath. "We missed you so much," Marcus said, his two bright eyes boring into mine. "But you're here now, and that's all that matters. We can finally be together forever." Part of me wanted to believe it. The part that had spent 3 months grieving, 3 months wondering what had happened to them, 3 months carrying the weight of guilt for not following them into the fog. They looked like Marcus and Jake. They sounded like Marcus and Jake. They knew things only Marcus and Jake could know. But they also knew I was coming before I'd decided to come myself. And their camp existed in a part of the forest that shouldn't have been accessible from where they'd disappeared. "How?" I managed to ask, my voice coming out as barely a whisper. They exchanged glances, and for just a moment their faces flickered like a bad television signal. When they stabilized, their smiles were wider, showing too many teeth. "Does it matter?" Jake said. "We're together now. That's what's important." "Come sit down," Marcus said, guiding me toward the fire. "We have so much to tell you, so much to show you." But I was already backing away, some primal instinct screaming danger even as my heart broke all over again. Because whatever these things were, they weren't Marcus and Jake. They were something else wearing their shapes, using their voices, mimicking their mannerisms with the uncanny accuracy of a predator that had studied its prey. "Sarah," not Marcus said, his head tilting at an unnatural angle. "Where are you going? Don't you want to stay with us?" I turned and ran. Behind me, their voices rose in harmony, not calling my name or pleading for me to come back, but laughing. A sound like wind chimes made of bones, like children playing games with death, like something that had never been human trying to mimic human joy. I ran through the twisted forest as branches clawed at my clothes and roots tried to trip my feet. The trees seemed to shift and move around me, paths appearing and disappearing, distances stretching and contracting like the woods themselves were alive and trying to prevent my escape. When I finally stumbled out of the tree line and back into the normal campsite, the sun was setting and fog was beginning to rise from the creek. I didn't wait to see what the fog might bring. I ran to my car and drove away as fast as the winding park roads would allow, not stopping until I reached the main highway. In my rearview mirror, I could see white tendrils following me through the trees, reaching out like grasping fingers before falling back into the darkness. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, the dreams have stopped, but the waking world has become its own nightmare. They're here, in Kansas City, in my apartment building, walking the streets and living among us. I see them everywhere now. People who move just slightly wrong, who smile too wide, who watch me with eyes that reflect light they shouldn't be able to see. Yesterday, I saw Jake buying coffee at the shop where I get my morning latte. He looked exactly like himself, dressed in clothes I recognized, even ordering his usual drink. But when the barista handed him his cup, I saw his fingers bend backward as he gripped it, joints flexing in ways human joints don't flex. 3 days ago, Marcus called my office. He sounded perfectly normal, said he was sorry for worrying everyone, that he and Jake had gotten lost in the woods but made it out fine. He wanted to meet for dinner, to explain everything. But when I asked him about the time we'd gotten caught in that thunderstorm camping in Missouri, our first trip together, a memory burned into both our minds. He hesitated just a moment too long before giving me an answer that was close but not quite right. And Amy has been texting me every day. Normal messages, friendly messages, the kind of thing the real Amy would never have sent. But I remember the face in the RV window. Remember the way she'd acted on the drive home. Remember how she'd seemed to know things she shouldn't have known and forget things she should have remembered. I don't respond to the messages anymore. Don't answer the phone when numbers I recognize call. Don't go to places where I might run into familiar faces that aren't quite familiar enough. Because I understand now what Roy meant when he said they sometimes try to live normal lives. They're not just mimicking individuals, they're replacing them, stepping into the lives of the people they've taken, wearing their memories like ill-fitting clothes, trying to blend in among us, and they want me to join them. Last night, standing at my apartment window, I watched 3 figures gather on the sidewalk below. Even from 5 stories up, I could see they were wrong. Too tall, moving with that fluid grace that suggested joints in places joints shouldn't be. They stood there for hours, faces turned up toward my window, waiting. Marcus was in the middle, Jake to his left, Amy to his right. All of them wearing smiles that were just slightly too wide, all of them perfectly still in a way living people never are. When the sun came up, they were gone. But I know they'll be back. They always come back. Dr. Martinez wants to increase my medication, says I'm showing signs of severe paranoid delusion. She thinks the stress of losing Marcus and Jake has broken something in my mind, that I'm seeing threats where none exist. She's arranged for a psychiatric evaluation next week, and I know what they'll find. A woman who's lost touch with reality, who sees monsters wearing the faces of people she loves. Maybe she's right. Maybe this is all in my head. A mind trying to cope with loss and guilt and trauma by creating elaborate fantasies of supernatural danger. Maybe Marcus and Jake really did just get lost in the woods and die of exposure or animal attack or simple misadventure. Maybe Amy is exactly who she's always been, and I'm reading sinister meaning into perfectly normal behavior. But I remember the fog. I remember the voices calling from the white, the shapes moving in the mist, the way the very air had tasted wrong. I remember the thing that spoke to me in harmony, the voice made of many voices promising that I belong to them now. And I remember finding that impossible camp in the woods, seeing the things that wore Marcus and Jake's faces but weren't them, feeling their 2 warm hands on my skin. So maybe I am losing my mind, maybe none of this is real, but the fog is rolling in again. I can see it from my window. White tendrils creeping through the city streets, flowing around cars and buildings like water finding its level. It's moving too fast, too purposefully, carrying that same sweet, sick smell I remember from the woods. They're coming for me tonight. I can feel it in my bones, in the way the air tastes of copper and rotting flowers. They've been patient, but their patience is ending. The phone is ringing now, Marcus's number on the caller ID. If I answer, I know what I'll hear. His voice, warm and familiar, asking me to come down to the street, telling me how much they've missed me, how much better everything will be once we're all together again. Part of me wants to answer. The part that's tired of being afraid, tired of running, tired of living in a world where everyone I love has been replaced by something wearing their skin like a costume. It would be so easy to give in, to walk down those stairs and into the fog and let whatever waits there take me too. But I remember Roy's words. You're lucky you didn't follow them into that fog. Lucky, because whatever happened to Marcus and Jake in those woods, whatever they became or were replaced by, at least I'm still me, still human, still real. The phone stops ringing. Outside my window, the fog has thickened and I can see shapes moving within it. Tall, wrong figures that flow rather than walk, gathering in the parking lot below. Waiting. I close the blinds and step back from the window, but I can still feel their attention like heat against my skin. They know I'm here. They know I'm alone. They know I'm afraid. But they also know I remember what they are. The building's fire alarm starts going off. Not the sharp, urgent beeping of an actual emergency, but a low, warbling sound that seems to come from the walls themselves. In the hallway outside my apartment, I can hear doors opening, voices calling out in confusion. My neighbors, checking on each other, trying to figure out what's happening. Only the voices are wrong. Too harmonious, too synchronized, like a choir that's been practicing the same song for years. And underneath them, That familiar sound. The wet, tearing noise I heard that night in the fog. They're not waiting anymore. They're coming up. I grab my keys, my phone, my wallet, the essentials of a life I'm about to abandon forever. Because I understand now that there's no going back, no return to normal, no pretending this isn't happening. Whatever these things are, wherever they come from, they've marked me as theirs. The only choice I have left is whether to face them as myself or let them turn me into another puppet wearing a human face. The elevator dings softly in the hallway. Footsteps approach my door. Too many footsteps, moving in perfect unison like a marching band made of nightmares. A knock, soft, polite, exactly the way Marcus used to knock when he came to pick me up for dates. "Sarah?" His voice, muffled by the door, but unmistakably his. "Sarah, we know you're in there. We just want to talk. We missed you so much," Jake's voice adds from somewhere to the left of the door. "We have so much to show you." And then Amy, her voice carrying that patient tone she used when she thought someone was being unreasonable. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Sarah. You belong with us now. You've always belonged with us." I back toward the window, my hands shaking as I fumble with the lock. 5 stories up, but there's a fire escape. Rusted and probably unsafe, but better than what waits on the other side of that door. The knocking stops. For a moment, there's complete silence, and I allow myself to hope they've given up, moved on to easier prey. Then the doorknob turns. I didn't hear a key, didn't hear the lock click open. The door just swings inward as if the metal itself had decided to cooperate. And there they are, Marcus, Jake, and Amy, standing in my doorway wearing faces I've loved and trusted, smiling those 2 wide smiles. But they're not alone. Behind them, the hallway is full of my neighbors. Mrs. Patterson from 3B, who always complains about noise. The college students from across the hall who blast music at all hours. The young couple with the baby who moved in last month. All of them wearing the same expression. All of them watching me with eyes that reflect light like mirrors. "Hello, Sarah," they say in unison, their voices creating harmonies that hurt to hear. "We've been waiting for you." I throw myself at the window, hands fumbling with the ancient latch as they step into my apartment. The metal is corroded, painted over so many times it barely moves, but desperation gives me strength I didn't know I had. The window slides open just as hands, too many hands with joints that bend the wrong way, reach for my shoulders. The fire escape is a skeleton of rusted metal that groans under my weight, but it holds. I scramble down the narrow ladder, not looking back, not thinking about anything except getting to the ground and my car and the highway that leads away from this city. Behind me, I can hear them following. Not climbing down the ladder like humans would, but flowing down the side of the building like liquid shadow, defying gravity and physics in ways that make my brain hurt to consider. I drop the last 8 feet to the pavement, jarring my knees but staying upright. My car is parked across the street, and I run for it through fog so thick I can barely see my own hands. The key sticks in the lock for a heart-stopping moment before finally turning, and I throw myself into the driver's seat just as shapes begin to emerge from the white wall behind me. The engine turns over on the 3rd try, and I gun it without looking back. In the rearview mirror, I catch glimpses of them standing in the fog. Not just Marcus and Jake and Amy, not just my neighbors, but dozens of figures watching me go. All wearing human faces, all smiling those impossible smiles, all perfectly still in a way that living things never are. I drive through the night, windows down to keep the fog from seeping in, radio turned up loud to drown out the voices that seem to call my name from every shadow. I don't stop for gas, don't stop for food, don't stop until the sun comes up and burns away the last wisps of white mist. The highway stretches ahead of me, leading west toward mountains and desert and places where the air tastes clean. I don't know where I'm going. Don't have a plan beyond putting distance between myself and the things that wear familiar faces. But, for the first time in months, I can breathe without tasting copper, can think without hearing whispers at the edge of my consciousness. I'm free. For now. But freedom is a relative concept when you're running from something that knows your name, your face, your fears. Something that can wear the shapes of people you love and use their voices to call you home to places that aren't home at all. In the passenger seat, my phone buzzes with another text message. I don't look at it. I know what it says, know who it's from, know that the words will be just slightly wrong in ways that only I would notice. The things in the fog are patient, but they're also persistent. They've marked me as theirs, and they won't stop coming just because I've put a few hundred miles between us. Because the fog isn't confined to Arkansas woods or city streets. I've seen it in truck stop parking lots, rolling across farmland, creeping through small towns where everyone smiles just a little too wide and watches strangers with eyes that reflect too much light. It's spreading. They're spreading. And somewhere in the distance behind me, carried on a wind that tastes of rotting flowers and old blood, I can hear them calling my name. I press harder on the accelerator and drive toward a horizon that might not exist, chasing a safety that might be nothing more than another trap wrapped in false hope. But what else can I do? What other choice is there when the alternative is to become another puppet in their collection, another face for them to wear when they need to walk among the living? The road stretches ahead, empty and endless under a sky that's the color of old bone. And somewhere behind me, patient as death and twice as hungry, the fog continues to roll. Story 3. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 34, and I made the mistake of thinking Gifford Pinchot National Forest was just another weekend getaway. The brochure made it sound like paradise. Towering Douglas firs, pristine lakes, and miles of untouched wilderness just 2 hours from Seattle. What it didn't mention was how the trees seemed to whisper your name when the wind died down, or how the shadows moved independently of their sources once darkness fell. I'd rented the RV on a whim after my divorce finalized. Tom got the house, the dog, and most of our friends. I got the lawyer bills and a desperate need to prove I could handle being alone. The 32-foot Winnebago felt absurdly large for one person, but I'd convinced myself I needed the space. Looking back, I think I was trying to fill the emptiness with square footage. The plan was simple. 3 days of hiking, reading, and pretending I wasn't checking my phone every 5 minutes for texts that wouldn't come. I'd picked a remote campsite near Mount Adams, far enough from civilization to hear myself think, close enough to bail if loneliness got the better of me. The drive up was uneventful. Highway 12 wound through increasingly dense forest, the afternoon sun filtering through the canopy in cathedral beams. I passed maybe 6 other vehicles in the last hour, mostly pickup trucks with kayaks strapped to their beds. The kind of rugged outdoorsman Tom always claimed to be but never quite managed to become. The turnoff to Taklak Lake was marked by a weathered Forest Service sign that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Reagan administration. The gravel road immediately tested the RV's suspension, every pothole sending dishes rattling in the cabinets. I'd made this mistake before, choosing style over substance, prioritizing the appearance of adventure over actual preparation. But as the trees closed in around me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation, not the anxious kind that had become my default setting, but genuine excitement about the unknown. Maybe this trip would be exactly what I needed. The campground appeared around a bend like something from a postcard. Taklak Lake stretched out before me, its surface mirror-smooth and reflecting the snow-capped peak of Mount Adams. A handful of other campers had already claimed the prime waterfront spots, but I found a decent site about 50 yards back, nestled between 2 massive firs that would provide afternoon shade. As I backed the RV into position, I noticed the family in the adjacent site watching me with undisguised curiosity. A middle-aged couple with matching REI gear and 2 teenagers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The kind of family that probably had laminated camping checklists and color-coded packing systems. The woman approached as I was leveling the RV, her smile just a bit too wide. "First time camping alone?" she asked, and something in her tone made it sound less like a question than an observation. "Not exactly," I lied, though technically sleeping in my car during college road trips didn't count as camping. "Just needed some quiet time." "Oh, you'll get plenty of that here," she said, glancing toward the tree line. "Especially at night. The forest gets very still after dark, very quiet. Sometimes you can hear things moving around, but you never quite see what they are. Her husband called her name, Janet, and she excused herself with another too bright smile. I watched her walk away, noting how she kept glancing back at me, and felt my first flicker of unease. There was something performative about their family dynamic, like they were playing roles rather than simply existing. I spent the next hour setting up camp, a process that involved more swearing and problem-solving than I'd anticipated. The RV's awning fought me like a living thing, and the supposedly foolproof leveling system seemed designed by someone who'd never actually used it. By the time I had everything functional, the sun was starting its descent toward the mountains. The other campers had grown quiet. Too quiet, I realized. No children's laughter, no crackling fires, no sounds of dinner preparation. Even the ever-present hum of generators had stopped. I stepped outside to investigate and found the campground eerily still. Janet's family was still there, but they weren't moving. All four of them sat around their picnic table in identical positions, hands folded, staring at the lake. They'd been like that for at least 20 minutes, completely motionless except for the occasional synchronized blink. When I called out a greeting, none of them responded or even acknowledged my presence. The elderly couple in the site across from mine had assumed similar positions by their fire pit, though their fire had died to cold ashes. A lone man with a beard and a dog was frozen mid-throw, his arm cocked back with a tennis ball while his golden retriever waited in eternal anticipation. I felt my heart rate spike as the wrongness of the scene settled in. This wasn't normal behavior. This wasn't any kind of behavior I could explain or rationalize. Every camping safety article I'd ever read flooded back to me. Warnings about staying alert, trusting your instincts, having an exit strategy. But even as my rational mind screamed danger, I found myself walking toward the tree line. Something was drawing me there, a compulsion I couldn't name or resist. The forest seemed to pulse with invitation, promising answers if I was brave enough to seek them. That's when I heard the humming. It started as barely a whisper, so low I thought it might be wind through the branches. But as I moved closer to the trees, the sound became unmistakably melodic. Multiple voices harmonizing in a tune that seemed familiar yet impossible to place. The kind of melody that gets stuck in your head without you realizing you know it. The humming was coming from deep in the forest, maybe a quarter-mile from the campground. Following it meant leaving the safety of open space and witnesses, but the alternative was standing alone with a dozen silent campers who had apparently turned into living statues. I went back to the RV and grabbed my headlamp, pepper spray, and phone. No signal, of course. The device was essentially a very expensive flashlight now. I thought about starting the engine and driving away, but the access road was narrow and dark, and reversing a 30-foot RV in those conditions seemed more dangerous than investigating strange humming. The forest floor was carpeted with decades of fallen needles that muffled my footsteps. The trees grew so densely that my headlamp beam barely penetrated 10 feet ahead. Every few steps I'd stop to listen, trying to gauge whether the humming was getting closer or if I was walking in circles. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 15 minutes, I saw light flickering through the trees. Not the steady beam of flashlights, but the dancing orange glow of flames. A campfire, maybe, or torches. The humming had grown louder and more complex, with individual voices weaving in and out of the main melody. I crept closer, using the massive trunks for cover, until I could see clearly into a natural clearing about the size of a basketball court. What I found there made my blood freeze in my veins. At least 30 people stood in concentric circles around a large fire pit. Men, women, and children of various ages, all humming in perfect harmony. They were dressed normally, jeans, flannel shirts, hiking boots, but their arrangement was anything but casual. Each circle moved slowly clockwise, while the people within it moved counterclockwise, creating a hypnotic spiral pattern. In the center of the innermost circle, a figure knelt beside what looked like a pile of camping gear. Backpacks, tents, sleeping bags, and coolers arranged in a neat pyramid. The kneeling figure was wearing what appeared to be a park ranger uniform, but the fabric looked wrong. Too stiff, too dark, as if it had been soaked in something. As I watched, the ranger lifted something from the pile, a passport or driver's license that caught the firelight. He held it aloft for a moment, then dropped it into the flames. The humming intensified as the plastic crackled and melted, sending up a plume of acrid smoke. More items followed. A child's stuffed animal, a woman's wedding ring, a man's wallet with photos spilling out. Each item was displayed to the circles of people before being fed to the fire, and with each addition, the humming grew more complex and urgent. I recognized some of the items. The stuffed elephant belonged to the little girl I'd seen at a campsite earlier. The wedding photos looked like they might be from the elderly couple's site. These weren't random possessions. They were personal belongings from the other campers. The implication hit me like a physical blow. These people weren't just participating in some weird ritual. They were the other campers. Janet's family, the elderly couple, the man with the dog, all of them were here, humming in these circles, watching their own belongings burn. But that was impossible. I'd seen them at their campsites, frozen but intact, just minutes ago. Unless what I'd seen weren't the real campers at all. The humming stopped abruptly, and 30 heads turned toward my hiding spot with mechanical precision. In the firelight, their faces were blank masks, eyes reflecting the flames like animals caught in headlights. None of them spoke, but I could feel their attention like a weight pressing down on my chest. The ranger figure stood slowly and pointed directly at me. When he opened his mouth, my own voice came out. "Sarah Chen," he said in my exact tone and inflection. Age 34, recently divorced, camping alone for the first time. The circles began moving again, but faster now, and I realized they were closing in on my position. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my headlamp beam dancing wildly ahead of me. Behind me, the humming resumed, but now it sounded like pursuit. Footsteps disguised as melody, breathing masked as harmony. I burst out of the tree line and sprinted toward the RV, expecting to find the campground still frozen in its eerie tableau. Instead, I found chaos. The campsites were in ruins, tents slashed open, gear scattered, vehicles with broken windows and slashed tires. The elderly couple's trailer was overturned, its contents spilled across the gravel. Janet's family's SUV sat with all 4 doors open, the dome light casting weak illumination over empty seats. But the people were gone. Not just absent. Gone. No bodies, no signs of struggle beyond the destroyed equipment. It was as if they'd simply vanished, leaving behind only the material evidence of their existence. My RV was untouched. I reached for the door handle with shaking hands, then froze. Sitting on my picnic table was a neat pile of items I recognized. My divorce papers, Tom's goodbye letter, the photo of us from our honeymoon in Maui, personal things I'd brought with me, private talismans of my failed marriage that I'd hidden in the RV's bedroom drawer. The humming was getting closer. I yanked open the RV door and dove inside, slamming the deadbolt behind me. The engine turned over on the second try, and I threw the transmission into drive without bothering to retract the awning or disconnect the power cord. The RV lurched forward with a grinding noise as the electrical hookup tore free. The access road seemed longer in reverse, every twist and turn revealing nothing but more trees in my headlights. The humming followed me for the first mile, a haunting harmony that seemed to come from the forest itself rather than any particular source. Then, gradually, it faded until all I could hear was the RV's struggling engine and my own ragged breathing. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway, and even then I kept going until I found an all-night truck stop near Mount Rainier. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the parking lot, surrounded by the comfortable noise of civilization, I finally allowed myself to believe I was safe. But safety felt fragile, temporary. As I sat in a booth drinking terrible coffee and trying to process what I'd seen, I kept thinking about the personal items on my table. How had they known about the divorce papers? How had they accessed my private belongings? And why had my RV been the only thing left untouched? I called the Forest Service emergency line and reported what I'd found, though I left out the more unbelievable details. Destroyed campsites, missing persons, possible foul play. The dispatcher took my information with professional efficiency and promised to send a team to investigate at first light. 3 days later, I got a call back. The ranger who'd gone to check on Taklak Lake said he'd found no evidence of any disturbance. No damaged equipment, no missing persons reports, no signs that anyone had been camping there recently. The sites I'd described were empty and clean, as if they'd never been occupied. When I insisted I could prove what I'd seen, he asked me to come in and provide a statement. I drove to the ranger station with photos I'd taken of the destroyed campsites, but when I tried to show them, the images showed nothing but empty campsites in pristine condition. The ranger was polite but skeptical. He suggested I might have been disoriented by altitude and stress, that camping alone for the first time could play tricks on the mind. He gave me a pamphlet about wilderness safety and recommended I consider camping with others in the future. I never went back to Gifford Pinchot, but the forest came back to me. It started with dreams. The humming would wake me in the middle of the night, so clear I'd get up to check if someone was outside my apartment. In the dreams, I was always standing in that clearing, watching the circles move around the fire, knowing that eventually they'd call my name and I'd have to join them. Then I started seeing familiar faces in crowds. Janet from the campground, smiling her too wide smile at me from across a coffee shop. The elderly man from the couple, nodding at me from a bus stop. The bearded man with the dog, walking past my building every morning at exactly 7:15 a.m. They never approached me directly, never spoke or acknowledged my recognition. But they were always there, just at the edge of my vision, reminding me that I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see, that I'd escaped something I wasn't supposed to escape. The worst part was the growing certainty that my escape hadn't been real at all, that I was still in that clearing, still watching the circles spiral around the fire, and everything since, the drive to the truck stop, the calls to authorities, my return to normal life, was just another part of the ritual. Sometimes, late at night in my apartment, I can hear the humming again. Faint but persistent, coming from somewhere I can't locate. And I know that someday soon, I'll have to go back. Not to Gifford Pinchot specifically, but to whatever that place really was. Because you can't unknow what you've known. You can't unsee what you've seen. And you can't leave a ritual until it's finished with you. Last week, I found a new set of camping gear in my closet. Top-of-the-line equipment I'd never purchased with tags still attached. A sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures. A tent designed for extended wilderness use. A backpack loaded with supplies for a weeks-long expedition. I don't remember buying any of it, but I know I'll use it soon. The humming is getting louder every night, and my dreams are becoming more specific. I can see the route now, not back to Taklak Lake, but deeper into the forest, to places that don't appear on any map. Places where the trees grow in perfect circles and the ground never sees sunlight. I'm writing this down because I need someone to know what happened, even if they don't believe it. Especially if they don't believe it. Because belief isn't required for truth, and truth isn't required for survival. Sometimes, the only thing that matters is whether you can keep humming along when the melody gets too complex to follow. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 34 years old. And I'm going back to the forest tonight, because the ritual isn't finished with me yet. The camping gear is calling from the closet, and I can't stop myself from packing it into the RV. I know how this story ends now. I've seen it in my dreams, heard it in the humming that never quite stops. But maybe knowing the ending isn't the same as accepting it. Maybe there's still time to change the last few notes of the melody, to break the spiral before it closes completely. Or maybe that's just what everyone tells themselves when they hear the humming start. I guess I'll find out tonight. Story 4. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 34, and I never forget a face. The Ozark National Forest taught me to. The winding gravel road that led deeper into the Arkansas wilderness had seemed like the perfect escape from the suffocating tension that had been building between Marcus and me for months. Our marriage counselor had suggested we take time away together, somewhere we could reconnect without distractions. The irony wasn't lost on me now. Marcus had been driving our rented Class C motor home for 3 hours, his knuckles white against the steering wheel as he navigated the increasingly narrow Forest Service roads. Behind us, our golden retriever Bailey whined softly from her travel crate, sensing the unease that had settled between us like fog. "This is far enough," I said, checking the GPS on my phone. "No signal. There's a clearing up ahead." The site we chose was beautiful in that pristine, untouched way that makes city dwellers feel both humbled and slightly anxious. Towering oak and pine trees formed a natural cathedral around a small meadow, with a creek babbling somewhere in the distance. Marcus backed the RV into position with mechanical precision, the same way he approached everything these days: efficient, emotionless, going through the motions. "I'll get the hookups," he said, already climbing out before I could respond. I released Bailey from her crate and watched her bound into the clearing, tail wagging, nose to the ground. At least one of us was happy to be here. The late afternoon sun slanted through the canopy, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that should have been peaceful. Instead, something about the place felt wrong, like we were trespassing on sacred ground. The first night passed without incident, though neither Marcus nor I slept well. He'd brought his laptop and spent the evening catching up on work emails, while I tried to read a paperback romance that now seemed absurdly optimistic. We spoke in clipped sentences about practical things: dinner, the weather, whether Bailey needed more water, carefully avoiding anything that might lead to another fight. It was the second morning when I found the first one. I'd taken Bailey for her morning walk along what appeared to be an old deer trail when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. A man, maybe 40 yards away, standing perfectly still between 2 massive pine trees. He was facing away from us, wearing dark clothing that made him hard to distinguish from the shadows. "Hello," I called out, raising my hand in greeting. He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that he'd heard me. Bailey's ears perked up, and she gave a low, uncertain whine. The hackles on her neck rose slightly as she stared in the same direction. "Excuse me," I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. The figure remained motionless, unnaturally so. I stood there for a long moment, waiting for him to turn around or walk away, but he might as well have been carved from stone. "Come on, girl," I whispered to Bailey, tugging gently on her leash. "Let's head back." I kept glancing over my shoulder as we walked back to the RV, but when I looked for the man again, he was gone. There was someone out there, I told Marcus as I poured coffee from our small pot. A man, just standing in the trees. Marcus barely looked up from his laptop. Probably another camper. Maybe he was looking for his campsite. He didn't move, Marcus, not at all. And when I called to him, "Sarah," his voice carried that edge of impatience I'd grown to hate. "You're stressed about us, about this trip. Your mind is playing tricks on you." The dismissal stung, but I didn't push it. We'd had this conversation too many times before. Me trying to share something, him reducing it to my imagination or anxiety or some other failing on my part. That afternoon, while Marcus remained glued to his computer, I decided to explore more of the area. Bailey seemed eager to get out again, though she stayed closer to my side than usual. We followed the creek for about half a mile until we came to a small clearing where an enormous oak tree dominated the space. That's when I saw the second one, a woman this time, standing at the far edge of the clearing. She wore a simple dress that might have been blue or gray. It was hard to tell in the dappled light. Her long hair hung loose around her shoulders, and like the man from that morning, she was perfectly, impossibly still. "Hello," I called, though my voice came out smaller than I'd intended. No response, no movement. She stood there like a mannequin, facing slightly away from me so I couldn't see her features clearly. Bailey whined and pressed against my legs, and I noticed something else that made my skin crawl. The woman's feet weren't quite touching the ground. She seemed to hover an inch or two above the forest floor, though that had to be a trick of the light and shadow. I backed away slowly, pulling Bailey with me, but kept my eyes on the figure. Just before we turned to head back toward the RV, I could have sworn I saw her head begin to turn in our direction. But I didn't wait to find out. "Marcus," I said when I burst through the RV door, "there's something wrong with this place." This time he did look up, probably because of the urgency in my voice. "What do you mean?" "I've seen 2 people now, just standing in the forest. They don't respond when I talk to them, and they don't move. At all." He frowned. "Maybe they didn't hear you. Sound carries strangely in the woods." "No, you don't understand. They're not moving like they're ignoring me. They're not moving like they're not alive." Marcus closed his laptop with a sharp snap. "Sarah, listen to yourself. You're talking about seeing dead people standing in the woods. Do you hear how that sounds? I know how it sounds, but you've been under a lot of stress. We both have. Maybe you should try to rest." The condescension in his voice made my cheeks burn. "Don't patronize me, Marcus. I know what I saw. What you think you saw." That night, I lay awake in the narrow RV bed listening to Marcus's steady breathing beside me and the subtle sounds of the forest outside. There was something hypnotic about the rhythm of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl, but underneath it all, I could swear I heard something else. Footsteps, maybe, or the soft sound of breathing that didn't quite match the natural cadence of the woods. Bailey, who usually slept at the foot of the bed, was restless. She kept lifting her head and staring toward the small window above the dinette. Her ears pricked forward. Several times she let out soft, worried whines that made the hair on my arms stand up. "What is it, girl?" I whispered, reaching out to stroke her head. She looked at me with those expressive brown eyes, and I could see her confusion and fear. "Dogs know things we don't," my grandmother used to say. "They can sense what's coming before we can." Around 3 in the morning, Bailey suddenly sat up, completely alert. Every muscle in her body was tense, and she stared fixedly at something outside that I couldn't see. A low growl rumbled in her throat, not aggressive, but warning. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could and crept to the window. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in stark black and white. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw them. They stood in a rough circle around our RV, maybe a dozen figures in total. Men, women, even what looked like children. All of them perfectly still, all of them facing our camper. In the moonlight, their skin looked pale, almost luminescent, and their eyes, their eyes were completely black, like holes punched in their faces. I stumbled backward, my hand pressed to my mouth to stifle a scream. Bailey was beside me now, trembling against my legs but not making a sound, as if she understood the need for silence. I forced myself to look again. They were still there, that silent circle of watchers. And now I could see that some of them were wrong. The woman closest to our door was missing most of her left arm, though she showed no sign of pain or distress. A man near the back of the group had his head tilted at an impossible angle, as if his neck had been broken. One of the children, a little girl with tangled hair, took a single step forward. Then another. She moved with a strange, jerky gait, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. I wanted to wake Marcus, but some primal instinct told me that would be a mistake. Instead, I crouched by the window and watched as the girl approached our door. She stopped just a few feet away and raised one small hand as if to knock. But she didn't knock. She just stood there with her fist raised, head tilted back to look directly at the window where I was hiding. Even in the moonlight, I could see that her mouth was open too wide, as if her jaw had been dislocated. We stared at each other across the glass in the darkness, predator and prey, though I wasn't sure which was which. Minutes passed, 10, 20, maybe more. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they began to fade back into the forest. Not walking away, but simply becoming less solid, less there, until the clearing was empty again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, Marcus found me sitting at the dinette with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "You look terrible," he said, though not unkindly. "Bad dreams?" I almost told him. Almost described the circle of watchers and the little girl with her dislocated jaw. but I could already see the expression that would cross his face, that mixture of concern and skepticism that meant he thought I was having some kind of breakdown. "We need to leave," I said instead. "Leave? We just got here. We paid for a week." "Marcus, please. I can't explain it, but something is very wrong with this place. I feel like we're in danger." He sat down across from me, and for a moment I thought he might actually listen. "Sarah, I know things have been difficult between us lately. I know you're unhappy, but running away isn't going to solve our problems. This isn't about our marriage, isn't it? You've been on edge since we got here. You're seeing things that aren't there. Imagining threats? I am not imagining anything." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, and Bailey lifted her head from where she was lying in her bed near the door. Marcus held up his hands in a placating gesture. Okay. Tell me what you saw last night." So I did. I told him about the circle of figures, about the little girl with the broken jaw, about the feeling of being watched. I watched his expression change as I spoke, saw the exact moment when he decided I was having some kind of psychological episode. "Sarah," he said gently, "you're describing hallucinations. Detailed, complex hallucinations. That's not normal." "I'm not hallucinating." "Then show me evidence. If a dozen people surrounded our RV last night, there should be footprints, disturbed ground, something." He was right, of course. I hadn't thought to look for physical proof. We went outside together, Bailey trailing behind us, and examined the area around the RV. The ground was soft from recent rain, perfect for showing footprints, but there was nothing. No marks in the dirt except for our own tracks and Bailey's paw prints. "I don't understand," I said, staring at the unmarked earth. "They were here. I saw them." Marcus put his arm around my shoulders, and for a moment it felt like the old Marcus, the one who used to comfort me when I had nightmares. "Maybe we should go home, get you checked out by a doctor." I wanted to lean into his embrace, to let him take care of me the way he used to. But something in his tone set off alarm bells. He wasn't suggesting I see a doctor because he was worried about my health. He was suggesting it because he thought I was losing my mind. "I'm fine," I said, stepping away from him. "I know what I saw." The rest of the day passed in tense silence. Marcus worked on his laptop while I sat outside with Bailey, trying to convince myself that everything was normal. But I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that didn't quite match the movement of the trees. As evening approached, I dreaded the coming darkness. Whatever was happening here got worse at night. I could feel it building like atmospheric pressure before a storm. "Maybe we should drive into town," I suggested as Marcus heated up canned soup for dinner, "get a hotel room for the night." "Sarah, we've been over this. There's nothing wrong here except your imagination." "What if you're wrong? What if there really is something dangerous and you're putting us both at risk because you won't listen to me?" He turned to face me, and I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not just skepticism, but genuine fear. Not of whatever might be lurking in the woods, but of me. Of what my behavior might mean for our marriage, our future. "If you're this afraid," he said carefully, "maybe you should call Dr. Peterson when we get back. Talk to her about adjusting your medication." The words hit me like a slap. I hadn't been on antidepressants for over a year, and Marcus knew it. He was already building his case, already preparing to paint me as an unreliable witness to my own life. That night, I didn't even pretend to sleep. I sat by the window with Bailey curled up beside me, both of us keeping watch. Marcus had taken a sleeping pill, something he'd been doing more often lately, and was dead to the world. They came again around midnight. This time, there were more of them, and they were closer. They didn't maintain their perfect circle, but wandered freely around the clearing, some of them passing within a few feet of our windows. I could see them clearly in the moonlight, and what I saw made my stomach lurch. They were all wrong, every single one of them. A woman with most of her face missing, a man whose arms bent the wrong way at the elbows, a teenage boy with something dark and wet spilling from his mouth. And the children. God, the children were the worst. Small forms that moved with that same jerky, puppet-like gait, their faces slack and empty. One of them, A man in what looked like old-fashioned work clothes approached our door. He pressed his face against the small window, and I found myself staring directly into his eyes. They were black, completely black, like looking into deep water at night. He smiled at me. His teeth were brown and broken, and when he opened his mouth wider, I could see something moving inside, something that might have been his tongue, but writhed like it was alive. I bit down hard on my knuckle to keep from screaming. Then he raised his hand and knocked. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on our door. Bailey went rigid beside me, every hair on her body standing up, but she didn't make a sound. We both understood, somehow, that silence was our only protection. The man knocked again, then again. Each time the sound seemed to echo not just through the RV but through my bones, vibrating at a frequency that made my teeth ache. I looked around frantically for Marcus, but he was still deeply asleep, the sleeping pill keeping him under even through the knocking. I thought about waking him, but I was terrified that any noise might bring the thing outside into our small sanctuary. The knocking stopped. For several minutes, everything was quiet. I began to hope they had moved on, that whatever game they were playing was over. Then I heard a new sound that made my blood freeze. Scratching, like fingernails on metal. It was coming from above us, from the roof of the RV. Something was up there, moving around, testing the boundaries of our shelter. The scratching grew more insistent, more purposeful, as if whatever was up there was trying to claw its way inside. Bailey pressed closer to me, trembling so hard I could feel it through the seat cushions. The scratching moved from directly overhead to the area above the bed where Marcus lay unconscious. Then it stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard something that made my heart race even faster. A voice, muffled but distinct, coming from directly above Marcus. "Let me in." It was a woman's voice, sweet and pleading. "Please, let me in. I'm so cold." Marcus stirred in his sleep but didn't wake. "I just want to get warm," the voice continued. "I've been out here so long. Please." There was something familiar about the voice, something that tugged at the edges of my memory. Then I realized why. It sounded like my sister Emma, who had died in a car accident 5 years ago. "Sarah," the voice called, and now there was no doubt. It was Emma's voice, Emma's intonation, Emma's way of saying my name with just a hint of her childhood lisp. "Sarah, please help me. I'm hurt." Tears started rolling down my cheeks. Part of me wanted desperately to believe it was really her, that somehow she had found her way back to me, but I knew it wasn't possible. This wasn't Emma. This was something else, something that had stolen her voice and was using it as bait. "I know you can hear me," the Emma thing said. "Why won't you help me? I'm your sister." I covered my ears with my hands, but I could still hear her. She was crying now. Heartbroken sobs that sounded exactly like Emma when she'd been little and had scraped her knee or broken a toy. "Please, Sarah. It hurts so much. I just want to come inside where it's safe." The crying grew louder, more desperate. Then, abruptly, it changed. The sobs turned into laughter, wild, hysterical laughter that went on until it didn't sound human anymore. Then, silence. I sat there shaking for what felt like hours, waiting for the next assault, but nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion began to overtake my terror, and I dozed fitfully in the chair. I woke to Marcus shaking my shoulder. Sunlight was streaming through the windows and birds were singing in the trees. "Hey," he said softly, "you okay? You were having some kind of nightmare?" I looked around the RV, disoriented. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. Had I dreamed the whole thing? "What time is it?" "About 8. I've been up for an hour, but I didn't want to wake you. You looked like you needed the sleep." I stood up stiffly, my joints protesting after a night in the chair. I need to check something. Outside, I walked around the perimeter of the RV, looking for any sign of the previous night's visitors. The ground around our door showed no footprints except our own. I climbed up on the ladder Marcus had used to check the roof connections when we first arrived and examined the roof itself. There, in the metal surface above where Marcus had been sleeping, were long scratches. Deep gouges that looked exactly like what fingernails might make if they were long enough and sharp enough to score metal. "Marcus," I called, my voice tight with vindication. "Come look at this." He climbed up beside me and examined the scratches, frowning. "These are weird. Maybe tree branches in the wind? Tree branches don't make marks like that. I don't know what else it could be." He climbed back down. "Maybe the previous renters had something tied down up there. Cargo straps or something." I wanted to scream. Even faced with physical evidence, he was determined to find a rational explanation that didn't involve believing me. "We're leaving," I said as I climbed down. "Today. Right now." "Sarah, no. I'm done arguing about this. Something is very, very wrong here, and I won't spend another night in this place." For a moment, I thought he was going to fight me on it. Then he looked at my face, really looked, and seemed to see something there that changed his mind. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let me break down the water hookup and we'll head out." As we prepared to leave, I felt a mixture of relief and unease. Relief at the prospect of getting away from whatever was haunting these woods. Unease because I could feel eyes watching us from the tree line. Not just one or two sets of eyes, but dozens, maybe hundreds. Bailey seemed to feel it too. She kept close to my side as we loaded our few belongings, her ears constantly swiveling toward the forest. Several times she let out low, warning growls at nothing I could see. Marcus was securing the water tank when I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. A figure stepped out from between the trees, a woman in a ranger uniform. She was solid, real-looking, not like the others I had seen. "Morning," she called out cheerfully as she approached. "How's your stay been?" "Fine," Marcus replied, though I noticed he positioned himself slightly between her and me. "Just heading out a day early." The ranger stopped about 10 feet away and smiled. She was middle-aged, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and laugh lines around her eyes. Everything about her seemed normal, even comforting. "That's too bad," she said. "This is one of my favorite spots in the whole forest. So peaceful. So private." Something in the way she said private made my skin crawl. "We've enjoyed it," Marcus said politely, "but we need to get back." Of course. The ranger's smile never wavered. "Before you go, though, I wonder if you might have seen anything unusual during your stay. We've had some reports of disturbances in this area." "What kind of disturbances?" I found myself asking, despite my eagerness to leave. "Oh, you know, campers seeing things that aren't there, hearing voices, that sort of thing." Her eyes locked onto mine. The mind plays tricks sometimes, especially when people are under stress. The words were almost exactly what Marcus had been saying to me. Too exactly. "We haven't seen anything unusual," Marcus said quickly. "Really?" The ranger tilted her head slightly. "Because I could have sworn I heard someone calling for help last night. A woman's voice. Sounded like it was coming from this direction." My blood turned to ice. She had heard the Emma thing. "We're heavy sleepers," Marcus said. The ranger looked back at me. "What about you, dear? Sleep well?" "Fine," I managed to say. "That's good. Sleep is so important, especially when you're trying to recover from trauma." She took a step closer. "You have been through trauma recently, haven't you? I can see it in your eyes." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. Those weren't the eyes of a park ranger looking at me. They were completely black, like holes punched in her face. "Sarah." Marcus's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Sarah, get in the RV." I stumbled backward, never taking my eyes off the ranger thing. She was still smiling, but her mouth was stretching too wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for any human mouth. "Don't go," she said in a voice that was no longer quite human. "We've been having so much fun getting to know you." Marcus grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the RV. Bailey was already at the door, whining to be let in. Behind us, I could hear the ranger thing laughing, and the sound echoed through the forest like it was being picked up and repeated by dozens of other throats. We threw ourselves into the RV, and Marcus slammed the door behind us. His hands were shaking as he started the engine, and it took 3 tries before it caught. "Don't look back," he said as we pulled out of the clearing. "Whatever you do, don't look back." But I couldn't help myself. Through the rear window, I saw the ranger standing exactly where we'd left her. But now she wasn't alone. The clearing was full of figures, all the watchers I had seen over the past 2 days, plus many more. They stood perfectly still, all of them facing our retreating RV, and every single one of them was waving goodbye. We drove in silence for almost an hour, neither of us speaking until we reached the main highway and saw other cars, other people, signs of the normal world. Only then did Marcus pull over at a gas station and cut the engine. "Jesus Christ," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What the hell was that? I looked at him, really looked, and saw my own terror reflected in his eyes. "You saw her too, the Ranger. Her mouth. God, her mouth." He shuddered. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry I didn't believe you. I wanted to feel vindicated, but mostly I just felt hollow. What were they? I don't know. I don't want to know." We never talked about what happened in the Ozark National Forest. Not to each other, not to anyone else. When people asked about our trip, we said it was fine, that we'd had to cut it short due to car trouble. Our marriage didn't survive another 6 months. Not because of what we'd experienced, but because of what it revealed about us. Marcus's willingness to dismiss my concerns, my growing inability to trust his judgment. The cracks that had been there all along became chasms. I kept Bailey, and we moved to a small apartment in the city. Sometimes, late at night, she'll suddenly become alert and stare at something I can't see. When that happens, I remember the feeling of being watched by things that shouldn't exist, and I turn on every light in the apartment. I never go camping anymore. The thought of sleeping in the wilderness, of being surrounded by dark trees and empty spaces, makes my heart race and my palms sweat. Because I know now that there are places where the boundary between our world and something else grows thin, where things that wear familiar faces wait in the shadows. And sometimes when I'm driving past a wooded area or walking through a park, I catch glimpses of them in my peripheral vision. Still, silent figures standing just beyond the edge of sight, watching, waiting. I never forget a face, but now I wish I could forget theirs. Last week, I was scrolling through news articles when I saw a headline that made my blood freeze. "Family of 4 missing after camping trip in Ozark National Forest." The accompanying photo showed a man, a woman, and 2 young children standing beside an RV that looked almost identical to the one Marcus and I had rented. They were last seen at a campsite in the same area where we had stayed. The search has been called off. Authorities say there's no evidence of foul play, no sign of struggle. The family simply vanished, leaving behind their campsite exactly as they'd set it up, as if they'd just stepped away for a moment and never came back. I wonder if they saw the watchers too. I wonder if they were smart enough to leave when the wrongness became too obvious to ignore. I wonder if they waved back. Bailey is getting old now, and sometimes she has trouble hearing. But last night she woke me up with her whining, staring intently at the apartment window. When I looked out, I saw nothing but empty street and parked cars under the yellow glow of streetlights. But for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a familiar figure standing under the oak tree across the street. A woman in a ranger uniform, perfectly still, facing my building. When I blinked, she was gone. I've been thinking about moving again, somewhere far from any forests, any empty places where things might be watching. Maybe the desert, where the landscape is too open and exposed for anything to hide. But deep down, I suspect it wouldn't matter, because I think they remember me too, these things that wear stolen faces and speak with borrowed voices. And I think eventually they'll find me wherever I go. The only question is whether I'll see them coming, or if they'll find a way to make me invite them in. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night to find my front door standing wide open, though I always lock it before bed. I tell myself it's the old building settling. Faulty locks. Anything but the truth. The truth is that something is still trying to get inside. And one of these nights when I'm tired enough or scared enough or lonely enough, I might just let it.